Welcome to this chess video. This game has a really interesting concept where, quite frankly, I got kind of lucky. But it wasn't luck in the traditional sense one might expect, where something happens just almost out of randomness. So this moment actually happens in the opening, so let's just get right to it. They start with d4, d5, c4. I played c6, and now they played knight c3, which objectively is playable. But rather than knight c3, if we go back, the more modern approach here is for white to play knight f3. And then only later will they play knight to c3. Now why start with knight f3? Because of course they can possibly transpose, and in many lines they will. But knight f3 actually has some nice benefits to it. For starters, it develops a piece in the direction you want to castle, and so that just helps white facilitate development better than if they start with the b knight going to c3. Because they're very unlikely to want to castle queenside after already advancing the c-pawn. The other reason why knight c3 isn't generally preferred is because black has the extra option of taking a little more ambitiously here, and after a move like e3 threatening to win this pawn back, there is now pawn to b5. And this move would of course be possible with knight f3 as well, but here we have the additional threat with tempo of playing pawn b4. And this is just simply unnecessary for white. It's not bad by any means, and of course if they study it, white can be fine in this line. But generally that's why knight f3 first is the preferred way. So I could have captured on c4 here. But instead of that, I know that if they know their stuff, they should be fine. And so I just continue developing knight f6. And if they want to play knight c3, and then knight to f3, we'll just play e6 and play some kind of semi-Slav setup. But now they go bishop g5. And it was still objectively fine if I were to just play e6 and go for the same slow idea. But now the fact that they delayed f3 for what seems like a second chance in a row, it was just too tempting for me not to capture on c4. Looking back, my capture on c4 wasn't really necessary, but I like my exploitative idea where I'm trying to take advantage of their weird move order. They play pawn e3, and of course I want to secure this pawn with b5 now. So now I'm simply up material, and if they don't start contesting my pawns here with pawn to a4, then they might be able to get into some trouble and possibly cramped. They do play pawn to a4. I play b4, which again might not come as early if this knight was not here, and knight f3 was played instead. But the game continues here with knight to a2. And unfortunately, this was not the mistake that I was referring to earlier. They gave me a chance to get the advantage, and I just blundered it back. Now, don't be too critical here. I played this game at like 4 in the morning, so I'm not claiming it's some masterpiece game, but it is instructional for the point that I'm about to make. Before we get to that moment, I'll have to show my move, which really just gives back the advantage, which was pawn to e6. I thought I wanted to get my dark square bishop developed. It also defends this pawn, and I thought my position was okay. And by all means it is. It's about equal, but I'm really letting white off the hook. Better was actually knight e4, which I would like to think I would find if I were to get this situation again. And if they bring the bishop back that was attacked, now I can play queen a5. Now this very idea I had here, putting this line on the king, was something that I did think of in the game, but it ended up in a little different move order. But this would have been an advantage for black. Continuing with the game, I let them capture on c4, giving back the one pawn. And now I try queen to a5. But objectively speaking, it was probably better to just continue developing normally, something like bishop b7 instead of the queen, and really catch up in the piece development, especially the minor pieces, that black very often lags behind in this opening when they try and capture on c4 instead of developing. But I like the fighting try with queen to a5, and this more or less forces them to trade on f6. It doubles black's pawns, which looks good from their standpoint, but it also just gets the hanging bishop out of the way. So they do this, and of course I saw that before the queen a5 move. But my idea in this point in the game was that white is probably castling kingside, with their c-pawn completely gone now, and the fact that their a-pawn is up here on a4, this doesn't really look too appealing for them to castle queenside. And so knowing that they were going to castle kingside, I actually didn't mind having dynamic possibilities of rook to g8, maybe the queen even coming to g5, and I'm already threatening checkmate here on g2. So next they played knight to e2, preparing to get castled. And now here comes the critical moment of the game that I really wanted to kind of focus on in this video. We'll probably go over the rest of the game as well, but I thought this was a really key instructional moment. Because in this position, black has a few good moves to choose from. Knight d7, just a normal developing move, being the top engine choice. But in this position, I realized just how bad my bishop was here. And by bad, I don't mean it was a terrible piece, but I mean in the sense of a bad bishop. If you're more beginner or intermediate range, you don't know what a bad bishop is, then check it out in this chess video here. I'll leave it linked in the video description, where I really like how I explain this concept. So I really want to trade off this bishop, and so I decided bishop to a6. And now when I played this move, I thought, well, how can they avoid the bishop trade? Coming back with bishop to b3 doesn't look that great, and I can always give up my bishop if I really wanted to. But in all likelihood, I'm expecting pawn b3. I'll just put pawn b3 on the board, and then I would trade, they take back. And now I can strike in the center with c5. And I thought I solved the problem with my bad bishop, which is true, and practically speaking, I like black's chances. But my idea isn't really the most optimal in this position, or rather the position we just came from. Because here, I was thinking of how to get rid of my bad bishop. But the surprising concept here is that white's best move is actually to capture my bishop. Instead, they played this blunder, but let's take a look at what happened if they were to capture instead. If they capture, best is queen captures, but white has a slight advantage, as I've now given up the line here. So I probably recapture with the knight, trying to develop a new piece. But now this allows either white to castle, or this relocating move. And if I ever push b3, they can just block the check. Now this wouldn't look so terrible, but the reason this really left an impression on me, and the reason I'm making a chess video out of this, is because of the instructional moment here. Default mindset was how to get rid of this bad bishop. So it didn't even occur to me that white would want to capture themselves. And it is that little mindset detail that I think is really a big weakness, at least in this game. If I had found something like this, and then the relocating idea, maybe I wouldn't have gone for that. And so the reason that I show this is because I think very often we are taught some general principle that happens to be right most of the time. I'll give you a good example of this. Very often, one side learns that they really want the bishop pair, and so ever since that moment of learning this, people are very wary to give up one of their bishops. But there are times where it is best to give up the bishop pair. It is what you get in compensation for it. And this is the same concept here, where I'm getting rid of my bad bishop, yes, but who has the bishop pair in this position? Well, it's actually black. And white, having already lost their bishop, doesn't mind trading bishops again. So even though I'm getting rid of my bad bishop, this bishop, if it was here back on c8, long term, might actually turn out to be a really good piece. If this concept of the bishop pair is new to you, I also have a chess video on the importance of the bishop pair. You can check that out in the video description as well. But now let's get to why this move is a blunder. Because as soon as they played rook c1, then I started realizing, wait a minute, this bishop move might actually be working. And this is more or less what I was thinking in the game. It was really that slight pause there in my thought process, and I'm thinking, this is actually working. Because here, now I have pawn to b3. And this is a really strong discovered check. The whole point being that if they block, especially on c3, now this piece is undefended because it's lost connection with the rook, and then bishop captures c4 simply wins the piece. And if they instead try and block with the queen, I can actually trade queens, and then this pawn is actually going to win this knight and be very close to promoting. Now granted, it's probably not going to promote successfully, but I'm already up 3 points of material now after winning the knight. And so objectively, white is actually lost already. They played the best move, which was to save their attack knight by the pawn, but as we just discussed, this will drop the bishop. So now we have to convert being up the extra piece, which is tougher than it sounds, and sometimes being down material is just a good excuse to start looking for really aggressive counterplay. They decide to castle because of course king safety is still important, but now I go after that immediately with rook to g8. I still like this move a lot, although looking back, objectively better was knight to d7, and I just continued to keep developing pieces while I'm up material. Now the reason I didn't play knight d7 in the game was I was actually a little bit concerned about a move like knight to e4, and now there's this discovered attack on my bishop, and I do not want to give back that piece. Of course black is still winning there for many reasons with several different moves possible, but in the game I really just wanted to move my bishop and have this pawn defended by the knight. And so I thought I could be a little bit flexible and play a move that I pretty much was sure about, and that move was rook to g8. Because I really wanted this idea I mentioned earlier, where I put this battery on their king, and continued to put pressure on their position. They went rook to e1, batter would have been knight e4 immediately, even though it allows me to trade off my bishop. Now trading my bishop is not so bad because I'm up material. So I play queen to g5. They stop the checkmate threat, And now to deter them from playing knight to e4, I play pawn to f5. They play knight f4, which is a good idea, improving their knight. And I went bishop d6, which again is a good move, but here the engine prefers knight to d7 for the same reasons that we just mentioned. They get their king out of the pin on the g file, and so I decide to capture here on f4. They take back. And then I play queen g4 because I am very okay with trading queens while I'm already up a piece. The goal here is for me to just simplify and get to a winning endgame. Or if they allow me, I might have some checkmate threat on their king. But at this stage in the game, I'm probably more inclined to go for an endgame. Now, of course, they do not want a queen trade, so they play queen to d2. But now I slowly make progress. Queen check to f3. And now I was thinking of how can they create counterplay. In this case, I was a little bit concerned with d5 on my radar. It doesn't quite work yet, but the idea is they're trying to open up lines of attack. And I never have pawn captures here because of the pin on my king. And so even though it's objectively not best, because I am up by a lot here, the goal is simply to simplify as much as possible. And the human approach is actually just get your king safer. So I decide to play king to f8, simply sidestepping the pin. And in some lines, I might be able to bring my king either to the corner, a little bit more sheltered, or I might be able to bring my king up, and then these other pawns, namely the doubled f pawns, actually help me shield my king a lot. They go rook e3, trying to kick away my very active queen, and so I just bring it back to h5. Retreat the knight to unleash this discovered attack on the bishop, and of course I'll just play bishop d5. But now the counterplay, of course, continues. If they're not going to resign, they're probably going to find ways to get to my king. This is exactly what we have here. So I go to g7, and now they're trying to win my rook that looks trapped in the corner. There's a few ways that black can survive this. One of them is threatening checkmate with queen h3. But the solution I like most is just pawn to c5. Simply defends the rook, so everything is holding here. They play queen to c7. And I would really like to develop, especially these pieces. C captures d4. They play this check. And now there are really two moves that I really had in mind. The first candidate move was king to g6, and objectively that is best, because really the queen has no more meaningful checks. But I wasn't so sure I'd like that, because now my queen looks a little bit corralled on h5. The other option is king h6, which is the one I did play in the game, with the same idea where I don't really mind if they give this queen check. Put it as a variation. And you can see that I'm completely fine here, and my king is very safe. Now keep in mind they can never capture here, and try and get greedy with the pawn, because there's many moves, including this one. They'll capture back, and then I'll just win the queen. But back to the real game, king h6, they capture the pawn. And now I play knight to d7. I could have played knight to c6, but now I also wanted to control this square to stop the check. They move the rook, which is a very human move to attack this piece, but I really don't mind trading. And they no longer can take my knight because I actually have back rank ideas already. They do decide to trade, and then stop the back rank ideas with the knight c3 developing move. Continuing to add pressure, I move my rook to c4 to attack their queen, and this is the fatal part where the game ends pretty shortly. They capture a pawn instead, but their queen is simply too far out of the game, and now the strong idea is rook captures c3. The exchange sacrifice works, because if you play rook recaptures, then queen d1 is checkmate. Don't forget the bishop controls g2. And if you play pawn instead, b2 and threatening promote is also good, but even stronger than that is just queen d1 check. They have to bring the rook back, and then this is also checkmate. So in the real game, they tried to hang on by bringing their rook back to the back rank to defend. But now I play queen f3, threatening checkmate on g2 and h1. They play king to f3. I just want to avoid counterplay, don't want to get anything too fancy. I found a checkmate which looks like to be 4 moves, and so I just went with it because it's all forcing and has checks. A little bit faster was instead rook c2, that was checkmate in 3. They can't bring their queen back to defend because this is checkmate. And the only way they can prolong it is to just throw away their rook with some spite check. I recapture, and they still can't stop the threat of queen h1, which will be checkmate. But instead of rook c2, the checkmate that I found first was queen h1 check, king e2, and now rook c2 check. If they were to go back to d1, bishop f3 is actually checkmate. They cannot block with the rook because the rook is pinned. And if they come up as they did in the game, then I have queen f3 check, another forcing move. And then when they block, I have this checkmate here. If they instead blocked with the queen, I play bishop c4 check, They are forced the only legal move, and then this is checkmate as well. And so I did well converting, but really I got kind of lucky on this moment here. Now of course my idea did work, because after this blunder I ended up with a fine position and saw how I could win the piece. But the problem is I did not see that way back here. So basically it's like when you solve a puzzle and you play the right move for the wrong reason. When you're solving puzzles, it's good to see all the way to the end and know why the move works, not just a guess method and then trying to slowly calculate and get the moves correctly as you go. Because here, I had to be weighing essentially the ideas of possessing the bishop pair versus ideas of getting rid of my bad bishop. And this is why chess is so difficult. Sometimes you have to evaluate fairly abstract and obscure ideas like this, which are very hard to put in material concrete terms. In some cases, getting rid of the bad bishop will be best, in other cases, keeping the bishop pair will be best. And this problem comes up time and time again in different versions in chess. For example, some situations it's better to have a piece, meaning 3 points. In other cases, it's better to have 3 pawns. Usually the piece is going to be superior to the 3 pawns, but there are exceptions to the rule. We see the same thing again, whether it's having a bishop or a knight, which one is better. And on the list goes. If you want another complicated example, there's also queen versus 2 rooks. What is better in that situation? I actually made a chess video on that a long time ago as well, so you can check that one out too. But the point I'm really trying to make here is that sometimes you have to be weighing the pros and cons of concepts that you have already learned. Not always will the bishop pair be something that you want to keep, and not always will the bad bishop be something you want to trade off. This is something that you just get the feel for after playing many chess games over and over, and you develop a bit of an intuition or pattern recognition after so much trial and error of playing. Now, of course, we can just call this experience and move forward, but I think a better way of thinking of it is simply practicing how to evaluate these harder to define concepts. So the point of this video here was just kind of open your mind, especially if you're a beginner to intermediate player, of some of the nuances that you really have to be weighing against each other in a game of chess. I hope this concept was helpful for everyone, and so I'll see you in the next chess video.